We've heard a lot of positive stories about internships and the use and so on. I just want to take a moment really to step back and just to reflect on a couple of things. What is it that's preventing businesses from providing the opportunity for more internships? And what is it that we can do to remove some of those barriers? To look at that, the first thing I think we need to do is to understand a little bit of the legal backdrop to the issue of internships. The whole area has really developed since the introduction of the national minimum wage legislation, which was in 1999. Since then, there has been a real blurring of the boundaries between people who are undertaking unpaid work experience and people who come under the definition of a worker for whom the national minimum wage applies. The philosophy behind the NMW legislation is actually pretty simple. If you're a worker and you're not in an excluded category, then you should be paid the relevant national minimum wage. It's when we start looking at what the excluded categories are that we start to see some of the confusion. In Robin's slides earlier, he picked up on this point, and that's that even people such as the government and MPs are abusing the system that is in place by choosing deliberately to blur those boundaries. There's three particular categories of excluded worker that I wanted to just touch upon. The first one is a legal statutory definition of somebody of a volunteer. The problem with that concept is the word volunteer is a word that we use in everyday parlance, but it has a statutory definition which is more limited. To come under the legal definition of a volunteer, and therefore outside the NMW legislation, one of the key criteria is that you have to be working for a charity or a government organisation or a social enterprise. Now that limits it to a lot of cases, and I'm certainly not aware of MPs being charities. We then have participants in official recognised schemes. That started off as sandwich courses, so students who were undertaking compulsory training as part of a 3 or 4 year sandwich course. That was excluded from the regulations. And we then have a more recent category of apprenticeships. They didn't used to be a separate category, but since October 2010, they were brought into the legislation as being a separate and distinct category with a national minimum wage, but at a lower rate than the full NMW. There is no exclusion in the legislation for interns. There is no recognised category for interns. So the only way to avoid the national minimum wage for an intern, if you're not on an approved scheme, is to ensure that they don't qualify as a worker. But doing that in practice is very limiting. People often ask me, what is the difference between, how do we decide whether somebody is really a worker or not a worker? There's two very easy litmus tests to apply to this. The first one is their attendance should be entirely voluntary if they're going to be not a worker. So if they don't feel like turning up on Tuesday morning, you can't complain, you can't say, well, where were you? You were supposed to be here at 9:30. Their answer could quite legitimately be, I just didn't feel like coming in today. There was a good film on at the local cinema, I thought I'd go there instead. How many people would really be happy with their intern taking that sort of approach? I may not do the intern's long-term career much good, but in terms of your expectations from them, I suspect most of you would be thinking, well no, I expect you to turn up when work starts. And the other thing is the concept of producing productive work as opposed to work shadowing. I draw the distinction, we have people who come through our business, we're a firm of solicitors, to my day job. We have people who come through as true work placement people, and they're typically 1 or 2 days. And we have people who come through on work placements, which we usually run for 2 to 4 weeks. The distinction is, if somebody's coming in as a work placement, they're coming in to shadow us. They will come with me to a meeting, to a court, whatever I may be doing. I don't even ask them to photocopy anything, because in my mind, photocopying is something which is a productive exercise, and that is something which is done by a worker. So I would not give photocopying to something as simple as photocopying to somebody who's on a work shadowing opportunity. I would give it to somebody who's on a formal work placement, I might get them to do some research or all sorts of other things. And that's the distinction. I think that's where the blurring comes, because the classic one that draws a lot of press attention are researchers for MPs. There are adverts, and you still see them even today, MPs advertising for their researcher, must do this, must do that, these are the job requirements. This is a volunteer role, he will not be paid. It just doesn't work under the legislation. But because MPs are doing it, it's creating a confusion in the workplace, because businesses are looking at it and thinking, well, why can't I get the benefit of that? What does all this mean for businesses? Well, the London Chamber did a survey, so it does surveys regularly, and the 2011 survey established that 61% of our member businesses do not offer internships. And that's an increase of 8% on the previous year. Those are worrying statistics. What's the reason for that? Well, a lot of the reason, when we discuss it with members, is that SMEs say they can't afford to offer full NMW for those who are traditionally coming in as interns and learning the ropes. Especially in tight times, their view is, I would rather choose somebody who has already got the skill set that I need for the role that I require, rather than having to spend the money to try and train them. What's the impact of that? Well, of course, that reduction in opportunities is hitting particularly recent graduates who, without the opportunity to gain experience in the workplace, finding it difficult to then find permanent roles. And we get into this sort of vicious circle. I'm going to touch upon a somewhat controversial subject here, which is the government's Get Britain Working programme, which seems to have been somewhat heavy in the news over the last couple of days. This is an attempt by the government to tackle what I see as this vicious circle, because it is offering real opportunities to young people who qualify for the programme to get work experience, which will then give them a much greater opportunity in the future to find hopefully permanent employment. The problem I see it is that opportunity has a couple of limitations to it. You can only go through this scheme if you are between 16 and 24 years old, and if you are currently claiming job seekers allowance. And finally, the work experience that you will be given is between 2 and 8 weeks in length. What's the solution to how do we get more businesses to provide opportunities for interns? Well, we see there's two potential solutions. The first one, and this is the controversial one, is to actually get the Get Britain Working programme wider, so that more people can participate in it. I say it's controversial because obviously there is this issue over the fact that they're not being paid, but of course they are getting the job seekers allowance through it. It's that job seekers allowance element which I think is a bit of a barrier, because there is evidence that shows that many people in this bracket, particularly in the graduates category, are choosing to go and take up a job which is below their skill set, for which they're overqualified, rather than claim job seekers allowance and do nothing. They perceive it that it's more important to get out there and at least do something in terms of doing some work whilst they're looking for a permanent role. But by doing that and showing themselves to be proactive and determined to try and progress themselves, they're actually excluding themselves from one opportunity that the government's providing to give them opportunities to get into work placement. So we would say, if you removed that barrier, that might give more people the opportunity to benefit. The other issue is the length of time that these work placements run for. As I say, the cap on them is 8 weeks. 8 weeks is a very short period of time in which to really assess somebody, from both perspectives. If the purpose of these work experiences is for people to gain a real element of experience, and indeed for the host business to look at somebody who might actually just be the right person they're looking for and for them to be offered a permanent role, we say that expanding that to 12 weeks would make all the difference to both sides. The problem is that there's a lot of press coverage about this scheme at the moment. A lot of big businesses being boycotted because of their use of what's perceived as free labour. And I think part of the problem is that in some ways the large businesses perhaps don't need to use this opportunity in quite the same way as some of the smaller businesses will really benefit from it. So it's giving it a bad character. I would like to see the scheme expanded, but I suspect it might actually disappear. I don't know. If David Willis was here, maybe we could have asked him his views on it. The second solution to this problem is a legal solution, and that's to create a new category in the NNW legislation for interns. We've got precedent for this. It was done for apprentices 2 years ago. How much better it would be for businesses if there was a clear, defined category in the legislation of an intern with a lower national minimum wage preset in the same way as there is for apprentices. That would take away some of the fear about the uncertainty of should they be paid, should they not be paid, and the financial barrier of having to pay at the full rate maybe being a little bit prohibitive for some small businesses. So to conclude, I say, without doubt, internships have a potential, massive potential, to reduce youth unemployment. But the legal confusion and the fears of the extent to which payment is required are acting as a barrier to business in offering those opportunities. Remove the barriers and we can create the right opportunities for young people joining the job market today, and they're the next generation for the future.
Do you know what the likelihood of a national minimum wage for interns sort of to come in as a particular category is?
There doesn't appear to be much appetite at the moment within the government for it. Whether the current debate over the Get Britain Working programme will change their views on that, I don't know. But certainly, to be entirely frank, at the moment there doesn't appear to be a huge amount of appetite for it.
Hi, I'm Pete from Future Foundation's youth training company. We had an intern come work with us last year who was doing so as part of their degree. So my question is there an extra category of which, because we didn't pay him, we paid him expenses, but he needed to be there for his degree to get an element of experience. So where does that sit in the categorising?
The legislation goes into a lot of detail about specifically which programmes and how they operate. But in broad terms, training, which is a mandatory part of a degree or similar qualification, is an excluded category, so that would be fine.
I'm just wondering, the first speaker, Robin Kennedy, spoke about the definition of work experience to 4 weeks, unpaid with expenses, bearing in mind that they're probably not just shadowing someone. Does that come under a definition of worker?
I think it does, personally. I don't recognise in legal terms work experience as a distinct category from internships.
Hi, Andrea from Internships again. I just wanted to make a comment regarding something that you said earlier, if I'm not mistaken, about SMEs not being willing to take on interns because of the resources that training them involves. I would like to disagree, because working so close with small companies and startups, I have noticed personally that they are very eager to take on interns, and that their approach to payment is slightly more specialized, and they take on interns, some of them which cannot afford national minimum wage for an intern. Simply take on an intern for 2 weeks with the promise that it will continue as a paid internship if everything goes well and if the intern rises up to the expectations needed. Do you think that's a legal or an ethical approach to paying your interns in the case of small companies?
Technically, it's unlawful, because if they're doing productive work, they can't be unpaid in that context. The problem is, and that's an illustration of exactly the point that we made, which is there is this confusion. People are trying to do the right thing. Businesses would like to take more interns on, but they're concerned about the position. Morally, I understand entirely why they're doing that. Legally, they should be paying from day one. The fact that they're doing it with a promise that if it works, there'll be a permanent job at the end, doesn't get them outside the requirement to pay under the legislation.
Only 43% of all internships in the UK are actually paid. So we're led to believe that the other 57% all fit into the excluded categories. And I'm guessing not. And roughly, do you know how many percentage aren't actually falling into the excluded categories?
But that is exactly the concern that we have, that that figure does not in any way reflect people who are in excluded categories, and that this is a system that is being abused and is being publicly abused for too long by profile organisations. Robin's slide talked about MPs, talked about the BBC, talked about the media world generally, and people see that all the time, and they therefore get confused about why the law appears to, if they ask somebody like myself what the position is, and we say, well, you've got to pay them, and they're looking at other businesses and saying, but they're not paying, and I don't understand why we're different. And the honest answer is, you're not different, it's just that they're breaking the law.
Because that's one of the things. As a charity, we're looking at bringing in interns in the next 12 months. Where can we go to make sure we are following the letter of the law and not falling into the 57% of people who are abusing the excluded category?
If you're a charity, you've got the big advantage that you may be able to use the volunteer the element of the excluded category. Anybody who advises on national minimum wage legislation will be able to advise you on that. Have a look at the legislation yourself. It is fairly user-friendly. There is guidance on the BIS website about the national minimum wage legislation. That's also worth